So, gunpowder units. Vital to the Vampire Coast, and pretty important for the Empire, Skaven, and Dwarfs. But they can be kind of difficult to work with, as they require direct line of sight to fire at all. So, I have gathered together a couple of basic formations that are conducive to gunpowder infantry, at least largely because I myself had quite a bit of trouble with gunpowder infantry when I first started playing Total War Warhammer. I should note these formations are also good for non-gunpowder ranged units, as pretty well all ranged units get buffs from direct line of sight. So I would say the most basic of gunpowder supporting formations is the checkerboard formation. And how it basically just works is you set up missile infantry with gaps in between them, and ahead of the gaps you set up melee infantry. And let's go ahead and see. You need the appropriate amount of space because you don't want to block your missile infantry. And basically the way the formation works is that your missile units get a good shot at the enemy, but the enemy cannot charge at your missile units because otherwise they would get flanked by your melee units that you have as the front checkerboard spaces. This one is good for when you've got about a 1-to-1 ratio of melee units or missile units, which, if you're playing the Empire or Vampire Coast, you probably will have about that ratio, as both of those armies kind of lack good melee units. For Dwarfs, you're probably going to have more of an inflation of melee units to your missile units. And let's go ahead and speed this up. It's mostly supposed to be used with melee infantry, though if you're playing Vampire Coast or Skaven, I suppose you could use melee monstrous infantry as your front checkerboard spots. Though that'd be kind of a waste of rat ogres, since they're really more like cavalry in terms of behavior. And as you can see here, the missile infantry actually gets a good open shot, and the direct shots are hitting the enemy melee infantry hard. Now, another nice part of the checkerboard formation is that when the enemy infantry... Yep, they're actually going for the handgunners, so just charge them out. Pull your handgunners out. So, this does happen. The AI usually is smart enough not to go for that, but it does happen. And the nice thing about checkerboard formation is that the AI usually gets stuck on the sides of your melee infantry. Now, in a case like this, the enemy is outnumbered quite a bit, because I didn't want this to be too difficult. I wanted to make it a pretty quick and easy little tutorial. So, in the cases where you outnumber the opponent with checkerboard formation, just kind of make it go inwards on them. Kind of like a closing... Imagine a crocodile's jaw, right? Closing on prey. Just as a basic example. Flanking, by the way, with gunpowder units is fantastic when you can do it properly. Though most gunpowder units are too slow to flank in any reasonable speedy way. So this is the one really basic formation. Like I said, it emphasizes a 1-to-1 build of melee infantry to missile infantry. I should note one particular build that I quite like with the checkerboard formation is when you have hybrid infantry that is quite good both in melee and missile fire, like let's say Lothern Sea Guard or Dwarf Quarrelers, and make a checkerboard formation entirely comprised of that one type of unit. The units in the front ranks get to fire off their missiles on the opponent's charge, then they fight in melee while the back ranks fire their missiles off, and then eventually the back ranks, once they run out of ammo, charge forward into the flanks of the units attacking the front ranks. And yeah, it's done a pretty good job here. I haven't been paying attention a whole lot, at least partially because I made the choice of having Reichland fight Reichland, so I don't know which units are mine and which units are theirs. But nonetheless, this has worked pretty well, and it works even better if you're actually paying attention, instead of talking like a gigantic knob. And let's go ahead and concede defeat and start up a rematch to display another formation that is pretty handy to use. This one is better suited to when you have a higher amount of melee units instead of missile units, so for the Dwarfs or the Skaven, this is probably what you're going to go with instead. And what I'm going to do here is, I'm probably going to show off two at the same time. Two strategies here. You'll notice I took a steam tank. And I didn't just take that for the laughs of bringing a steam tank to a matchup that is already heavily favored in my side. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead. I like to get my units out of the way when I'm setting formations up. Makes things a little more simple to do. So what I'm going to do here is get these guys out of the way. And I'm only going to bring out 2 handgunners as I only really have space for 2. Like I said, this formation is more suited for when you have a higher ratio of melee infantry to missile infantry. And even then, this is not going to be the proper ratio. Let's go ahead and get rid of these handgunners just to demonstrate how it would work. Okay, so these handgunners here, and then it's chevron formation. You make chevrons out of 2 units of melee infantry. And what you'll want them to do is you'll want them to overlap on this end so that they cannot be flanked. Here we go. Let's move this missile infantry just a little bit out here. And for the spearmen, we'll go ahead and do this. The basic idea here being that these chevrons are a little stronger than the front checkerboard pieces, and they make use of 2 units of melee infantry instead of 1. It's virtually impossible to flank the chevron, as the chevron is really only vulnerable from the rear. And this central byway here is covered by the missile infantry. Now, if you have more infantry units than this, which you should, then you would continue to build out more chevrons from here. Have another chevron on this side of these handgunners, and so on. However, I took a limited amount because I didn't want to make this too big and grandiose. I wanted to keep it a little simpler. And I think you can already see how this is going to play out, so let me go ahead and demonstrate another very common strategy with Gunpowder, which makes use of monsters. So obviously this strat is not available to the dwarfs since they don't get monsters, but for the Skaven, the Empire, and the Vampire Coast, they can take some kind of big, scary entity with lots of health and armor, and just stick it in front of the Gunpowder units. A lot of people instead choose to go with Lords or Heroes, and that can work very well for the Dwarves, since they have such tanky Lords and Heroes. And we're just going to leave these guys out pretty well as bait. And let me go ahead and turn off Fire at Will for the steam tank, so it doesn't just wreck the enemy as they come in. Excuse me. And basically, the enemy will mob around the steam tank and the Empire General here, which will allow the handgunners to fire on them while these guys are getting bogged down in melee. And there is one last gunpowder tip I do want to mention for formation that I did not get to show. So if you've got a particularly steep hill or cliff in this case, then you can use that. As long as the handgunners can get a good line of sight down at the enemy, they can snipe them from up here on this position. I did not get to show this in this particular video because for whatever reason the pathfinding AI for the handgunners has been bugging out on this cliff. I actually got an outtake of an incident that I recorded. It worked once and then I did a bunch more tests and it didn't work after that. So your guess is as good as mine. But nonetheless, if you can figure out your way around the pathfinding, then you can do some good work with cliffs like this. And another thing I want to emphasize with hills in particular, since hills, a cliff here, you can't leave a unit halfway up the cliff. It's insurmountable. But hills, you can absolutely leave a unit of, let's say, spearmen halfway up the hill, and then handgunners at the top of the hill. That won't work, because the spearmen are going to be blocking the handgunners' line of sight. Along similar lines, you can't leave spearmen at the foot of the hill and have the handgunners halfway up the hill, because they'll still have their line of sight blocked. With a hill, and this will only work with steep ones, I should note, a shallow hill is not going to work very well. But you want the melee infantry at the foot of the hill, and you want your handgunners at the crest of the hill. And let's just go ahead and see how this strategy works. Yep, it's working about as well as I thought. I should note that overlapping melee infantry usually isn't a good plan, because it's the melee infantry, when it gets bogged down, takes a lot longer to actually kill anything. But in this particular case, we're using it as a defensive strategy, in which case we don't really care about blobbing up infantry, because the idea is to hold the line anyways. And let's go ahead and tell these guys to charge in. You always got to keep in mind you want the jaws to shut here for checkerboard and chevron strategy, so that the melee infantry can't just charge your missile infantry. And it's going pretty well. We are crushing them pretty hard. Though the odds were more than a little stacked in my favor. One last thing I should note, and this is just... What the hell are these handgunners doing? One thing I should note that is another good thing to keep in mind here, is that these strategies can nonetheless be vulnerable to flanking. The checkerboard strategy, the missile units are in the back, and with chevron strategy, the chevrons can still be hit in the rear. So it's usually good to keep one or two rear guard melee infantry units. Slayers if you're playing dwarfs, spearmen if you're playing the Empire, so on. And yeah, that's a quick summary of the extent of my knowledge of easy gunpowder formations. Hope that I was able to help someone.